harder, better, faster, stronger.
All right. So as I mentioned earlier, and as Dave mentioned, the program today is built around this mission dominance. Now that Dave, you said thing about the photo, my teeth are so white in this photo. They're not really like that in real life. I don't know why it's like that. We've built a program around the mission dominance model, what we're going to do today in the agenda is really mapping to the different phases of essentially decision-making processes to support modernization and resiliency efforts. So today's opening panel is really focused on identifying the problem and prioritizing your efforts, given all the variables and context. We're going to have a conversation around that. And so I'm going to have the panelists introduce themselves, and I'll start at the far right with Emily.
Hello, I'm Emily Frye. I'm the Director of Cyber Integration at the Center for Securing the Homeland at the MITRE Corporation.
Thank you, Emily. Aaron.
Hello, my name is Aaron Bishop, and I'm the Department of the Air Force's Chief Information Security Officer.
Thank you. And David.
Yes, good morning. My name is David Salvanini. I'm the, under the ICCIO, Intelligence Community CIO, I'm the Chief Architect and Group Director for the Architecture Integration group at ICCIO. Excellent. Thank you, guys.
We had a great conversation this morning, kind of getting the juices flowing on this. I think to start with, a question out to the panel. I mentioned that the program is built around mission dominance. You know, how does, it seems like an obvious question, but I think it's good to level set. How does the mission impact priorities, and where do they come from? I'll throw it to anybody.
Sure, I'll take one. Since everyone's quiet, I agree with Candace, this quiet crowd. So from my perspective, I'm obviously a part of the Department of Defense, and the Department of Defense takes risk in everything they do. When we fly, when we drive tanks, whatever it is that the Department of Defense does, it's got risk associated with it. So when you start talking about mission, then the question becomes, well, we'll take risk anywhere. Well, really, should we be taking risk anywhere? So when we prioritize our time, especially now in peacetime, we should be hardening what we do, our critical infrastructure, our mission capabilities, our IT systems, our OT systems. We should be focused on fixing them now, because knock on wood, hopefully we don't have to, but if we get to a point where we have to do something that's a little more exciting, it's going to be a different world and we won't have the time to harden it then. And that's where, from my perspective, we have to spend some energy thinking through what is mission, what does it mean, what are all those dependencies, and then how do we take care of them now?
I would offer this. There are some priorities that obviously we have the latitude to select during the course of our duties based on the landscape, based on the environment we operate in, and some that are selected for us. Our ICCIO, Dr. Merritt, would often say our adversary has a vote. And we often are responding and reacting to some of that landscape as it relates to our mission equities as well. Within the ICCIO, we have 5 priorities. Those priorities are very much informed by the landscape. Those are multi-cloud, because as most of you know, the IC has awarded a very large 15-year multi-cloud contract to 5 cloud providers. So getting that right is critical to our future, both from a resiliency perspective, but also from a security perspective. Zero trust, of course, is something that was given to us that we have to react, respond, and appropriately plan for. So that is one of our priorities. Cybersecurity, as Colonel Frost mentioned earlier, the cyber landscape, as you all know, is quite alarming, quite threatening. We have very sophisticated actors that look to do harm in so many parts of our infrastructure, not just the intelligence community, not just the Department of Defense. So we have to address that. Workforce. So think about, why would workforce be a priority and why would diversity be a priority? Because quite honestly, we're in a talent competition with industry and with others, and we have to attract the kind of talent within government, as you have to do as well to maintain your competitive edge. But we don't necessarily have some of the appeal that you may be able to offer, at least financially. What we do have is we have mission appeal. We have the opportunity to do great things for the country. And then the last priority for us is partnerships. And really, that was talked about earlier as well. Partnerships with industry, but partnerships with allies as well, so that we can harness the great thinking that comes from diversity, from perspectives, but also, especially with industry, when we think about how we innovate within the federal government. A lot of our innovation is not necessarily organic, but it is through our partnerships with our private sector, especially our strategic partners within the private sector.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I would pick up especially on your points, David Salvanini. We have a couple of Davids running around here today. I would say there are two things I'd like to highlight. One is whenever you walk into a space and you're looking at the mission of this space, there's going to be a time in which you can acknowledge what is this space already good at. And so when we think about mission priorities, I think it's really important to acknowledge the strengths that are in the space that you're engaged with. Lift up those strengths and don't try to fix what is not broken. Lift up the strengths and sustain them. But then part two of that, I think, is think bigger about what mission is. And so both of you have pointed at this aspect of, do we really understand the cyber aspects of our mission? And so there are other things like supply chain. Do we really understand what is happening in the supply chain that makes our mission possible? So let's open up the aperture. When I think about this organization that is now my mission, right? When I'm walking into that space, what is their mission? And what are the big pieces of that mission beyond what they're already good at that we need to select to strengthen? We can't strengthen everything, so let's select carefully what is essential. In this space, is it essential for this mission that we secure that supply chain? Or what is it that we must be careful about as we actually execute the mission and plan for mission execution in the 5 to 20 year time frame?
So on those, and that's a great way to frame the conversation. When you're planning and prioritizing these large-scale deployments or modernization efforts, what are the various data points that you all are taking into account and considering, and where are you getting them from, and how are you capturing them from your stakeholders?
From my perspective, we get a lot of inputs. We get inputs from higher authorities. We get inputs from the people who own the missions. We get inputs from people who say, hey, look at me, I've got an issue that needs to be resolved. And you have to kind of blend them all together. You layer on compliance, you layer on risk, you layer on all these other factors, and then now you start to have this big bowl of stuff that you have to go through. And like Emily was saying, you've got to kind of figure out selectively, intentionally, and do your best to correctly identify those that are most critical and work downward from there. That effort in the Department of Defense is called mission assurance, being able to know I do X really well, and what are all the things that are dependencies in order to make X happen, whatever that might be. And that's where you get your information and your informed decision making. Hey, I've got this huge vulnerability. It might be lack of workforce. It might be IT vulnerability. It might be supply chain vulnerability. It might be any number of things that you identify that is a dependency to execute that mission. You've got to now inventory that and figure out where does that rack and stack. To Emily's point, it's not an infinite bucket of time and money, so we've got to start somewhere. But I'd also add that it's more than just the prioritization of the focus that you're working on, but you also need to look at how do you set the guardrails and empower the entire workforce to help you on this mission. You can't do it alone. I don't care who you are. It's impossible. So if you are not helping to set an expectation and help coach the one to many so that the many can then become your army of followers to help you on this journey, you're not going to get there.
So within the IC, we pursue risk-based modernization. Risk-based modernization, it sounds quite obvious. I mean, why wouldn't you do risk-based modernization? But an example of that would be, what does the data tell you about the risk environment? Where are you most vulnerable in your infrastructure? Because to the point made earlier, there's never enough money to do everything at any given point in time. So you're always having to select where you put your time and attention and your resources. So one for us, for example, that rose to the top of the pile was cryptography modernization and looking at quantum resistant cryptography. There is an inventory of legacy encryptors that do need to be replaced. So that would be an area where, again, a risk-based approach to modernization and the application of funding and energy toward a problem that, if not addressed, is going to become increasingly risky for us, rose to the top of the list. So I'll stop there as one example of how we apply sort of risk-based modernization across the IC.
So I have a bunch of things popping around my head based on what you just said. One of the things that I think is really important to acknowledge is the reality of where are we in this space. So for instance, within the IC or within the Air Force or within the Department of Transportation, whatever it is that you're working with, you have to actually build things in stages. And when we think about modernization, I think a lot of times what we're thinking about is, I want to go buy not just the latest brand of good technology or good capability, I actually want to buy a little bit ahead because I know the government is going to move fairly slowly, and so I want to get a little bit ahead now so that I'm not behind in 5 years. And I actually think that we should think twice about that. I think we want to be using essentially the best of the best. And what we all do, and I do this in my life and I do this in my work, is I'm very interested in what's new. I'm very interested in what's new. But I would encourage all of us to think twice about going for the most new versus what I know I can rely on, given the importance of the mission. It is always important to innovate, and for purposes of innovation, we have many programs around the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, and other research and development communities, IARPA, DARPA, HSARPA. We want that innovation to continue, but when we are going for modernization, we should carefully balance the weight of where we put our dollars and our process engineering around what we really have confidence will support mission execution. At the same time, I want to share a small story. Recently, MITRE was good enough to send some of us up to MIT for some sort of executive training. And there was this guy there, his name is Charlie Fine. He started the Asian School of Business based out of MIT as a collaboration between MIT and Singapore. And one of the things he said to us in this training was, be a little bit paranoid. And I thought, oh, that's really interesting. But you just gave an example of that, right? So while you stay on course with, I am really looking for solid performance, we know this is going to support my mission, always have someone on your team, or even if you're big, have a little team that has the job of being somewhat paranoid, a little bit paranoid, right? What is out there that you haven't accounted for as you stay on course? Don't go rushing and chasing every gold object, but be aware, am I fundamentally missing something? And that's the job of the little bit paranoid people. So quantum resistant cryptography, we do need to pay attention because it will change the security of our online transactions. So things will emerge from the little bit paranoid crowd that actually eventually need to become part of that mainstream work.
That's a great point, and it's a good segue to the next question I have. All of you have led and been involved with major technology deployments and building kind of long-term roadmaps, and we kind of talked about this on the prep call. What are the common missteps that you have observed, and what processes can we put in place, and can the audience put in place to avoid them based on kind of your experiences?
Scope. Simple as that. We try to do too much too fast. Scope. If you want to try to help manage that, tighten it up, control it, scope. I can't put it any other way.
I would add to that as well. So I'm actually leading an effort across the IC right now to build a roadmap for the IC to inform a lot of the investment, but also inform a lot of the tech insertion that we would pursue over time. The guidance from some of our leadership will sometimes take the form of be bold, Well, okay, I understand bold. I know what that looks like to some degree, but it's contextual, right? So bold to Google probably looks quite different than bold to a government organization. So, now what do I do with that? And I think that goes to scope as well. Bold for me might be doing something that is probably commonplace, for the last 5 years elsewhere. But because maybe we move a little bit at a different pace, it could be quite bold. So sometimes there's a lot of boldness and a lot of value in the simple, not necessarily the elegant, shiny, most innovative, because meet the organization where it is in its journey to mature itself. And I think that's important as well. So you've got to connect with where the organization is on its journey to mature itself as it relates to tech modernization. And in your road mapping efforts, it can't be a work of fiction. It has to be grounded in pragmatic thought with measures so that you can grade yourself over time. And I would say a 5-year roadmap in IT is somewhat problematic in and of itself because IT changes so rapidly. So okay, so maybe we forecast 5 years. That said, we have to have a refresh cycle. So the process that we're putting in place out of my office is really a perpetual road mapping activity. Okay, we'll take a 5-year snapshot in time and we'll relook at it every year and we'll adjust it. So there has to be that recognition that it can't be a static document. It has to be something that is dynamically updated on a regular basis. I can go on, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think both of those are really apt. Scope really matters. And then the point about 5-year roadmaps, it's really hard to see, right? It's really hard to see it in a jungle of fast-moving trees, fast-growing trees. Trees don't move that fast, but they grow. So I guess I'm thinking about your comment about meet them where they are and scope. One of the things that we often encounter is we'll walk into an environment and somebody in the federal government who's really a change leader and they want to go fast and go far. They'll say, I want to, so thinking specifically here about cybersecurity, we will often hear, I want you to help me do threat-informed defense. Because threat-informed defense is kind of an advanced stage. It's not the be-all and end-all, but it is an advanced stage of cybersecurity, and it has received a great deal of press. And yes, it is a fantastic thing to do threat-informed defense in your cyber arena. But what's often missed by that is that meet them where they are. Where is this organization? If you think about Bianchi's pyramid of pain and the basics that must be in place, you can't just go sprinkle in a little bit of threat-informed defense. And that's not how it works.
And add some AI to that.
You must actually build your foundation of baseline capability and build it strong before you can begin to add advanced skills with any meaningful impact. So think about impact. What is the highest impact thing that we can be doing about this problem in this organization, given where it is right now? And if the highest impact thing that we can be doing in this organization at this time is actually, we're gonna get really good at the 20 critical controls, that's a win. So make that your scope. What is the smallest executable step to scope that is actually a mission impact win? And go there first.
And all of you hit on something. Those are great points. And I think, David, may I'll start with you because you used the word. Then how do you measure? So once you have a finite scope, you're understanding what the priorities are, what's the mechanism by which you measure your success and I think then report on it? Again, given all the lack of, I think David talked about earlier, the lack of kind of standardization across government and how we communicate.
So I'll open with a thought there. Part of my group, I run the standards activity for the IC. So we publish the IC standards. I do that actually in cooperation with DoD. So we have a Joint Enterprise Standards Committee, JESC, that we call. and we co-chair that with a colleague at DoD. So standards are one way, and part of our architecture practice is performing enterprise architecture compliance assessments. Not particularly, I mean, it's a necessary work. It's probably not favored when I roll into an organization and say, hey, we're going to do an enterprise architecture compliance assessment. But for the major system acquisitions within the IAC, we do just that. And we basically measure them against the standards that are published. Are they adhering to the eyesight standards? And are they adhering to the other standards? The eyesight standards, if you're not familiar with, are really largely about common services and integration. Don't create your own identity service if there's an identity service that you should be consuming as an authoritative source for identity and attribute data. So I think that's one. Measures are hard for us, I would say, in the government. This is where I think we can learn from our private sector partners, because private sector organizations clearly have much more quantifiable measures for monetary reasons than we often have. So we're endeavoring down this path as it relates to zero trust. So we have OMB has made an investment for the IC. So there's funding now for the next 5 years to help us with our zero trust journey. And one of the things our OMB colleagues are going to expect is through quarterly reviews is a report card from us. So we've given you X amount of funding. What are you doing with it? And how are you advancing the ball, so to speak? So I don't have a clear answer, but I will tell you that our overseers expect nothing less than good, prudent oversight as it relates to any of the investments that are made in any of our activities. So we're always subject to question from not only organizations like OMB, but our congressional overseers as well.
So I think measures can come from external factors such as standards and OMB direction. I think there's also a role for something else, which is collaborative, jointly defined measures of success or impact that you have with all your stakeholders. So let's say I'm in the middle of a major acquisition, and what that acquisition is going to involve is a set of services that have to do with looking at the risk associated with my suppliers of certain key goods, right? So I have a set of suppliers for, let's call it in this case, software, and I want to have greater insight into the risk associated with the suppliers, per se, of the software. So I would suggest that what we need is not so much only a set of external measures, which do help us understand system-wide how everyone's doing, but also when I and whoever it is I'm contracting with actually agree that we are after a certain goal. The goal here, which again ties back to mission, is I need to understand the ownership and control of my suppliers, and I need to have regular refresh, and we can agree that these are the goals of our work together. And if we could create small intervals, like quarterly or 6 months, at which there's a quick check. Are we actually on track with what we both agreed, or what we all agreed, because you may have multiple vendors in this situation? What did we all agree was our purpose? Are we on track with where we thought we'd be 6 months into this relationship? Or do we need to make adjustments? And so those collaborative, all stakeholder around kind of metrics, I think, are equally important, because that's where you get to the ability to partner effectively. It's not just the ability to report up effectively, it's the ability to network across all contributors to mission execution in a way that builds us all toward we're driving in the same direction, and we know we're on track, or we know we kind of went that way.
Can I add one thought to that as well? So there's another element to this, and I think at the crux of it is culture and leadership. And that is making sure that what we're holding people accountable are those things that are going to really actually make a difference. In speaking with our ICCIO the other day, she talked about cyber theatrics. And cyber theatrics are sort of the things that we kind of maybe feel good about, but they actually don't help. And the analogy she used with us was, back in the day after 9/11, when we would take our belts off at the airport. and you think to yourself, well, okay, shoes and belts. Now, perhaps that was threat informed, I'm not sure. No disparagement to TSA, but that was probably a sort of a feel-good measure. So we have to make sure as leaders that we're not pursuing feel-good measures as part of our metrics, and we're pursuing the things that will really help us advance the ball towards those critical things that need to be accomplished. The theory is what gets measured gets done. And I think as leaders, we have to make sure we're measuring the right things.
Yeah, those are great points. We have a few minutes left. I want to talk about, and you talked about leadership and culture. Let's talk about the human element in projects. I think particularly one thing that we talked about, again, on the prep call that I found interesting was, how do you plan and develop roadmaps? Everyone chuckled when we talk about 5 years. So there's a lot of technology advancement. There's also people change. Administrations change. People come in and out of government, which changes in priorities. Depending on who's coming in and out, priorities may change significantly. How do you account for that? And again, how can you build roadmaps that essentially minimize the impact that those people changes will have on the ultimate success of the project?
So I think all of us probably can reflect on our careers and say, we had this leader who was dynamic and made things happen. Problem is, when that leader changes roles or leaves, then what happens? Did it fall flat? That was personality driven rather than an enduring capability. And then that becomes what we need to be thinking about, especially as we talk about these long-term journeys. There's nothing about cyber that's short-term. Everything has got to build to a bigger, longer journey. And therefore, it has to be enduring. It has to have that understanding that everyone is going to participate in this regardless whether personality comes and goes. And if you don't build that way, build the metrics that way, build the processes and culture and standards that way, the workforce that way, it's a waste of time. Absolutely.
So in our road mapping activity, where, typically what you would see in an organization is you would publish some document and say, here it is, the roadmap, or the strategy, or the implementation plan. What we're doing instead, and this is something we're trying, and I don't know that it's novel, but I'll share it as if it is. It's novel in my mind, at least for the organization I'm part of. We're building a very exquisite database. And basically, when an object is on a roadmap, what I call a dot that has a temporal representation, in other words, we're going to insert X at some point in time in our future, we classify that dot. We call it, and we have an object class, and we have a lot of attributes that describe it. So now we have a lot of data about the roadmap items. I might equate this to something that, and this isn't an endorsement toward Gartner, but Gartner has their hype cycles, and they have dots, and they track dots over time. And that's exactly what we're endeavoring to do with our roadmap. So through this object class, as we're able to slice and dice the data about the roadmap in a lot of different ways, we're also able to tailor it to various different stakeholders. A CFO versus a CTO versus a mission partner who might have a different perspective on what they would like to see, funded, unfunded, high risk, moderate risk, et cetera. So that's the approach we're taking to sort of deal with change. And what we're looking to do is to prevent the heroics that you spoke of, is we're looking to create an enduring practice here that repeats itself. I have to credit the CFO colleagues. Their budget process, it's like a train going down the track. It doesn't stop for anything. It just keeps going and going, and it repeats itself every 3 years. I mean, so there's a lot of predictability there. And what we're endeavoring to do with our roadmap process is create that same level of predictability in our planning. It perpetually will run, and it will perpetually update as well.
That's great. Unfortunately, we're at the end of the time for this panel, so I'd like to just close by asking everybody, and Emily, we can start with you. We covered a lot of important topics and gave a lot of great advice. If there's one thing we want to make sure that the attendees walk away from having learned from this discussion, what is that one thing that they should walk away from? And Emily, we'll start with you.
Don't be afraid to innovate in acquisition. It's a very scary thing that has a lot of legal risks, but there are people out there in the acquisition community who are true experts, and they can find ways to accomplish goals. So lift up your real experts in acquisition and go toward invention.
I'd say the word cyber risk means nothing to anyone. So if you're going to play in this space, make sure you're communicative with all the stakeholders, because if you're not on the same page, cyber risk will not work.
And I would say strategic partnership. Please don't be afraid to be our strategic partner as industry leaders. And when I say strategic partner, that doesn't mean, about your margins. That means about the good of the total of government, right? I mean, sometimes your margins might not be in the best interest of the enterprise at large. And I love the conversation earlier about open standards. So I think that's critical. Help us basically be open. There's plenty of business, there's plenty of work. When I think about the multi-cloud, there's plenty of hosting opportunities for government data. Okay, but we have to have the fluidity and the flexibility to be able to move our hosting across clouds. That's going to require open thinking, open standards approaches to things. So, and it's going to require good strategic partnerships that are not just thinking about margins and market share.
Those are all excellent points, and that's why we're here. That's why ICIT exists, to help facilitate all of those recommendations. Please help me in thanking our panelists.
Master,